Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it another 5 or 6 minutes or so, and we'll plan on starting right at 12:30 p.m. Lucas, do we have some royalty-free elevator music we can play?
That will be in next year's package.
Hey, now we're talking. I could sing a song. I don't know that I have a 5-minute song memorized. I
I'll
won't do that to anyone.
I'll show a preview for you at Weldon. We'll work on that.
I appreciate that. For those just joining, we're going to be going live right at 12:30, so about 4 more minutes. Looks like there's a few people who are fiscal policy nerds like myself and would prefer to talk about performance funding than teacher recruitment scholarship programs. Don't worry, I won't tell the teachers. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Got about 1 more minute and then we'll kick off. All right, I see it's 12:30, so we'll go ahead and begin. Before we do a couple housekeeping items, first of all, the time is 12:30, which means that I hope many of you have already eaten or are currently eating your lunch. I will do my absolute best to keep this as lively as possible, to keep you awake. I also have tried to close the blinds in my office, but I may also start dozing if the sun doesn't alleviate a little bit here shortly. So feel free to throw something at me. If there's tomatoes in chat, feel free. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. It's one of my favorite topics because I have lived and breathed higher education performance funding for the last 3 years, and for 4 years before that, worked in the space. And so I really believe in what we're going to be talking about today. Hopefully, I can share with you the impact that performance funding is having and has had on Indiana and on completions for our students. But I also look forward to sharing some of the challenges we still face and some of the issues that we're trying to address. Something I think Indiana can be very proud about is we have had an ever-evolving funding formula for more than 20 years. We have not rested on our laurels. It is constantly kind of being tweaked and adjusted and improved upon. And I get to stand on the shoulders of giants who've come before me to really start this work, especially those professionals at the commission and our public and private institutions who have done a great job collecting the data that we require to put together this analysis to be able to provide performance funding in the first place. So thank you again for joining me for this discussion about performance funding, and we will go ahead and jump in. And one other note, today is my first day back from new parent leave. My wife and I welcomed our fourth child into the world about 2 weeks ago or so. So if I'm a little rusty, I apologize. Hopefully we'll pick up steam as we go through. So what would a commission presentation be if I didn't begin by talking about the big attainment goal? This is the goal initially set out by the Lumina Foundation that Indiana adopted many years ago, which basically identified by 2025, we were seeking 60% of our population to have of our adult population to have a post-secondary credential. And we've made progress on that. We're up to 53% from 33% in 2009. But it's important to note that our progress has not been even across the board. A great deal of that progress has occurred in the associate and sub-associate space, which of course is incredible and important. We are a national leader, fifth in the nation for sub-associate degree attainment, which is something that I know our Ivy Tech and Vincennes colleagues and our other institutions are very, very proud of. But it's something that Hoosiers should be really proud of, to be fifth in the nation in that, and something the commission remains committed to and focused on in partnership and collaboration with our institutions is the stackability of those short-term credentials to ensure that a student who may start off with a one-year certificate or maybe even earning something at like the College Core in high school can turn that into an expedited pathway to an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and greater attainment in the future. And as we'll talk about in a minute, which is strongly correlated with increases in earnings and a number of other positive social outcomes. But as I mentioned, we've made a lot of progress towards that 60% goal, but you can tell we still have a long way to go. Specifically, we are 39th in the nation in attainment for adults with an associate degree or higher. So there's a lot of improvement to be made there in the higher degree attainment. Something that we've been looking at a lot in the last year in particular is comparing other states who were in similar places, Indiana, many years ago, and trying to understand what they've done to make the improvements they've made in their overall attainment. So as you can see here on the right of the graph, this is the bachelor degree or higher attainment ranking. And we look back at 1960, which I won't age my commissioner, but that matters to him. And you can see that Indiana, North Carolina, and Georgia were all similarly ranked, lagging the nation in bachelor's attainment and higher. You fast forward to 2022, and Indiana has really not moved. We've actually technically lost a spot. However, North Carolina and Georgia have drastically improved to above the middle of the pack in the nation for educational attainment. And so it leads us to asking a lot of questions, and we're still in the early phases of understanding that. But it's important to note that this highlights that states really do have an opportunity to make a meaningful impact and meaningful change in this space. So zeroing in from attainment at large to what really the number one driver of that is, and that's the Indiana college going rate, right? So this is your high school graduate college going rate. And this is a measure of any post-secondary enrollment. So not just enrolling in a four-year program. This could be a certification, a certificate program, et cetera. And what we've seen is in the last several years decline from really a high of 66% in 2012 down to 53% in 2020. And we have thankfully stemmed the bleeding. We have flatlined that decline at 53% for 3 years, which is something to be happy about. But it's certainly not where we want to end, and we have a lot of goals to increase that attainment, that going rate, because obviously if only 53% of our high school students are even attempting post-secondary credential within a year after high school graduation, it's going to be very challenging for the state to improve its overall educational attainment in the next couple of years. I think it's really important when we talk about the going rate to really put that in perspective. So let's say for an illustrative example, we have 100 high school freshmen. Importantly, we're talking about freshmen here. Out of those 100 high school freshmen, 13 won't graduate. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily drop out. Some of them could transfer out, but we lose them, right? So from freshmen in high school that we know of, 13 of them aren't there come senior year. 41 don't attend any post-secondary offering. And this is obviously a huge concern for the state at all levels. We're hearing a lot from the Department of Education, about enlistment, enrollment, and employment. And while we hope that a great number of these are falling into that employment bucket, there's a lot of reason to be concerned with our workforce participation rates of young men in particular, that there are a lot of Hoosiers who are just falling through the cracks entirely in that 41%. 7 of those high school freshmen will enroll out of state. And the simple reality is where you go to school is an incredibly strong predictor of where you will have your career, grow your family, and make your life. And so while we are still thrilled that 7 out of 100 high school freshmen graduate high school and do enroll in college, we would love to see more of those students enroll here in Indiana. 8 of those students enroll in a 2-year college. 7 of them enroll in a private college here in Indiana, and 24 enroll in a 4-year college. Something I think is worth pointing out, if you do the math there, it's less than 53%. So we talk about the 53% high school going rate. That's only of high school seniors that graduate. If you go back to high school freshmen and you consider the 13th that don't graduate from Indiana high school, there's actually a much lower going rate. So the pipeline narrows over time. And why does this matter? We refer to this as our economic 4x4, and it's really, really important to point out some things. Everyone understands, I think, and appreciates that by and large, on average, an individual with higher degrees of educational attainment experience higher average net worth, higher earnings over their lifetime. But something that we don't talk as much about, that we're trying to speak more on, is the unemployment rate and the workforce participation rate. So based on this 2024 data, if you have less than a high school diploma, your workforce participation rate is 44%, so only 44 out of 100. Whereas if you have a bachelor degree or higher, you're at 73%. So nearly a 30 percentage point increase in your workforce participation from less than a high school diploma to a bachelor's degree. And so we think it's really, really important to know it's not just about earnings, it's also about workforce participation, which is super imperative to the state to provide the workforce and labor that our employers in our economy need so that they can invest here in the state, provide higher quality of living, and the cycle continues. But just as important as those economic 4x4s are the social metrics that we measure. Things like the share of adults receiving SNAP benefits, infant mortality. One of the most stark metrics on here is that there's a 13-year difference in the life expectancy of a Hoosier who has less than a high school diploma compared to a Hoosier that has a bachelor's degree or higher. And again, these are really, really important issues facing Indiana. We'll also, and I'll come back to this because we're talking about funding today, so I think it is worth noting a national snapshot. This data is provided by SHIO in their annual state higher education finance report, or the SHEF report. It's a really, really good resource for trying to make apple-to-apple comparisons across states, which can be a very hard thing to do in higher education because of different funding models. But it's worth noting that Indiana ranks 43rd in the nation for state support per FTE for our institutions. And what this means is the inverse relationship is that students pay a disproportionately high share of their educational costs for their institutions. And in Indiana, because the state is the 43rd in the nation for providing state funding per FTE, students pay the 5th highest share of educational costs for their institutions. And so it's important to note there are really two major sources of revenue for public and private institutions, for public institutions, and that is student fees in the form of tuition and state funding in the form of appropriations. On the other hand, though, our public institutions in Indiana have done an incredible job holding down tuition costs for the last decade. I cannot stress this enough. I cannot give praise enough to the past commission work, to the General Assembly, to our institutions for making this a priority. But in the last decade, we've actually, when accounting for inflation, had a significant decrease in tuition prices because our public institutions have held the line on tuition growth. And for lack of better words, they've been under inflation basically the entire time in that last decade. So it's important to note that our institutions are absolutely operating in a financially efficient manner to keep costs down for their students at a time when state aid, while it is stable and not volatile like some states experience, it is 43rd in the nation. So how does performance funding fit into this conversation? The commission in the state is trying to tackle overall attainment. Our institutions are being frugal with the dollars they do receive from both students and the state, keeping tuition down. And the state, while providing stable funding for institutions, does lag most of the nation in the amount of funding on a per student basis it applies. Well, that brings us to performance funding. I will use performance funding, outcomes-based performance funding, OBPF, interchangeably for the rest of the presentation. I apologize. There's probably a joke here about the number of times we've renamed performance funding here at the commission. But at the end of the day, it means the same thing. And essentially, it is the way in which the state awards state dollars to our public institutions. There's a little nuance here. It's 7 systems or 7 institutions. But there's 15 or so different campuses, including all the regional campuses, that are included in the funding formula as separate units. So it gets a little confusing. But we've kind of recently come out with this new understanding of the purpose of the performance funding formula, and that is as a 3-legged stool. And each leg is important in a standalone sense, but really when you put the 3 legs together, you create what I believe and what the commission believes is an effective policy tool. The funding formula at the end of the day is that it is a policy tool to leverage state dollars to produce the results for our students at our institutions that the state desires. And so the first of those legs is incentive and accountability, right? And so this should be very straightforward. The state provides new state dollars that are on the line, if you will, or at risk that institutions can earn through an incentive model. Meet this goal, earn this dollar. But it also creates accountability on the flip side. And accountability is not just withholding unearned dollars. Accountability is also recognizing that there's a lot of public discourse and a lot of public eye on the funding formula. And so it's just the simple reality that you will see discussions, commentary, both on campuses, here at the commission, with legislative leaders, business leaders, when institutions meet certain goals and don't meet other goals. And so it isn't just about the funding component. It is also just the policy recognition of we've succeeded, we've made progress, but not fully met the goal, or we've actually backtracked and not made progress. So that's the first leg of the stool. The second leg is investment. It should not be lost after just speaking about our ranking as 43rd in the nation for state funding for post-secondary education, that it is important to the commission that this tool also serve as the mechanism to provide new state investment to our institutions to improve our state funding. Because the simple reality is more state funding reduces the need for institutions to pull additional dollars from students and their families in the form of tuition. So it is still a policy objective that this tool does provide a manner for dollars to flow to our institutions. And the third, and in many, many ways, I think this can be the most important. And I'll kind of get to which institute, I'll kind of get into that in just a moment, but it's policy, or kind of what we like to talk about as the boardroom narrative. There is incredible, incredible public policy power in getting an institution president and their trustees talking about the performance funding formula, or more specifically, talking about the components of the commission's funding formula, which are, I'll get to the next slide. It is not always about the dollar. Something many people don't know is every institution relies on state appropriation to a varying degree. Our research institutions that have incredible marketplace power, have incredible out-of-state enrollment power, incredible research funding, only about 20% of their operating dollars actually come from the state. Whereas our community college, Ivy Tech, relies on the state for about 60% of its operating dollars. So because of that, each of these components of the stool impact those institutions in varying ways and to different degrees. So it's also important to note that you can't just have one single policy. So for example, investment in incentive and accountability is probably a little bit, the incentive component is probably a little bit less important to an institution relying on the state for 20% of its funding than it is for an institution relying on the state for 60% of its funding. But inversely, it could be just as important for all institutions at that policy level to be in lockstep with the state when they're communicating with their alumni, when they're communicating with their boards of trustees, when they're communicating with their communities, state leaders, et cetera. And we've seen this a lot. I'll get more into this later, but graduate retention, which isn't what we're talking about today, is one in particular where we are providing a relatively modest financial incentive for institutions to focus efforts on graduate retention. But the boardroom narrative, the policy narrative around graduate retention has been incredibly powerful since the commission has talked about it over these last 2.5 years. And so that's an example where the policy component is arguably more important than the incentive. And then, of course, we have aligned this policy stool through the lens of the HOPE agenda, which is really a number of different measurements to identify Indiana as a top 10 state and a place to kind of grow and do business based on the strength of human capital and provide socioeconomic opportunity for Hoosiers. And we do that through enrollment, completion, which we'll focus on today, and brand new, and actually I think first in the nation, graduate retention is a component as well. So this is what we call the talent pipeline. This is how we think of the enrollment, completion, and economic and graduate retention metrics. Down there in the bottom bucket, you'll see the different metrics. I've kind of put some quick highlights here. I won't read this to you, but this is how we think of the talent pipeline. Very, very important to state the following. When you put a big goal out there that says we want to be a top 10 state in all these areas, or we want to reach 60% educational attainment, the reality is Indiana has to address our enrollment decline through the high school going rate. We have to turn that around. You have to complete more students who enroll in the first place, hopefully complete them on time, and you have to retain more of those students at the end. If you enroll every high school student, but none of them complete, enrollment falls short. If you complete every student who enrolls, but your enrollment continues to go down, you won't reach that 60% goal. And if you enroll every high school senior and you happen to complete them all, but they all move out of state for economic opportunities elsewhere, you're not going to move the needle. So each component of this pipeline must be addressed in some manner in order for the state to improve its educational attainment and deriving those economic opportunities for Hoosiers. So very quickly, because I am long-winded, I want to quickly give a high-level history of performance funding. This is something that Indiana really can take a bow at the national stage because we really were a leader, an early adopter of performance funding. And it really goes back to the early 2000s. There was no legislative mandate for the commission to implement performance funding. The legislative mandate of the commission is to make essentially a budget recommendation and generally recommendations to the legislature and governor on matters related to higher education. And they kind of used that to spur this idea of making budget recommendations tied to some performance measures. Early on, enrollment growth was the primary focus, and obviously we're talking about completion today, so we'll get to that transition in a moment. There were also inflationary adjustments in the early 2000s, and there was money for research funding as well. But then in 2007, 2009, there was a transition to what was then the new model for performance funding. And it created a much deeper focus on completion and on time completion, which at that time was relatively novel. Here's a very high level look at, and you'll notice it stops at 2019 because the document became obtuse. But it's important to note that there have been many changes over time, but completion and on-time completion are now the longest standing components of performance funding in the state. They have been the least changed and the longest utilized and measured components within funding formula. And really, with the new formula updates that were reviewed by the Budget Committee just a month or so ago, effective for this upcoming biennium, assuming the General Assembly funds the model in the 25-27 budget, which we are, of course, very hopeful that they do for all the reasons we're talking about today, there will be 20 years of completion focus in the funding formula. So then when we look at what we now call the legacy formula and we look at the metrics, it only counted completion metrics, which of course is incredibly important because enrollment without completion is a broken promise or an empty promise, as the common refrain goes. And so we looked at on-time completion because that is a key driver in overall completion. Tons of research shows that a student who's on track to complete on time is more likely to complete overall. And so that continues to be a focus both within our financial aid programs and the funding formula. Overall completion, that's just the actual count of degrees conferred. At risk or low income completion, that's using Pell in eligibility to determine that at the time of completion. STEM or what was formerly STEM completion, or also what was formerly referred to as high impact degrees, and then persistence. And persistence was essentially a indicator that indicated a student was on track for on-time completion, and it was really kind of a technicality to make sure that institutions who played a significant role in the progress of a student but did not ultimately complete that student still received recognition and funding for playing that role. So for example, if you spent 2 years at Ball State and then transferred to ISU, Indiana State, but you were on time, you were on track to complete on time at Ball State would have been rewarded incentive funding for that. And also importantly, the legacy metrics only looked at resident students. And I think this is somewhat obvious in the sense that, state funding in many ways discounts the cost of tuitions for Hoosiers, right? There's a significant differential between resident tuition and non-resident tuition. As any of you who have children or you yourselves have gone to an out-of-state school. And so because of that, the funding formula was laser focused at resident students. And again, we also know that residents are the most likely to be retained in state at a rate of nearly 3-to-1 as non-resident students. So the way the legacy formula worked, it essentially measured change between 2 3-year averages, which is frankly really clever. The 2 3-year averages would smooth out the data over time, so you wouldn't have these super jarring drops and hills and valleys. So it did create a little bit of consistency there, but it was a performance improvement model. And that's something to know. Since 2009, Indiana's funding formula for higher education has been an improvement model, which at times can be chafing for some institutions who believe that they are operating at a very high degree of performance already, and improvement can be viewed as more challenging when you're already operating at a high level. But in the legacy model, funding lagged by 3 to 4 years. A good example would be that for fiscal 26 and fiscal 27, the upcoming state biennium, they would have been using essentially the newest data would have been using 2018 through 2020 completion data. And so there was a significant lag in that model. The challenge here is that if you had a new institution president, new leadership, new focus of the commission, it would take several years before you could see the results of any of that incentive. And additionally, the legacy model had a single funding pool for all institutions. And the reality of that meant that your institution could improve against itself, but your improvement was always measured against every other institution's improvement. And so if you improved, but someone else improved more, you actually may not receive funding. And that was one of the primary challenges with the legacy model. I won't go back through all of this, but one thing I do want to know is, the funding component of this is hugely important. The legacy funding model was really rolled out in earnest during the Great Recession. And because of that, there were 2 biennia where there was no new state dollars available for higher education. But they didn't want to just not fund this new model that the state had spent a lot of time and resources in developing. So what they determined was they would fund it by reallocating funds from the existing appropriations to each of the institutions into this new performance pool. And what we saw was that what began as essentially the exception or the reason for reallocation was the lack of new state dollars. It became the rule. So in fiscal 2010, there was 5.1% reallocation. You fast forward 13 years later to fiscal 23, there was still 5% reallocation. Now, thankfully, in between there, following the Great Recession and the recovery since, the state has added money on top of reallocation and new money, usually somewhere between 2 and 3% a year. And so that has supplemented it. But the reality is you would still see institutions who were improving losing state appropriation one year to the next because they weren't improving as much as another institution. And so at a very high level, the legacy model has some benefits, right? There's funding certainty. Institutions knew exactly what they were going to be appropriated each year of the biennia. There was data smoothing that occurred with those 2-3-year averages, but it was a zero-sum game. There were institutions that there was an institution with a 2% appropriation reduction in 23 and another institution with a 10% appropriation increase in 23. That doesn't mean that the institution with the decrease had across the board declines. It just simply meant that the institution with the most significant increase was dragging not just new funding, but a lot of reallocation from institutions to them. There was a significant data lag, and generally speaking, because all 7 institutions were in the same formula, there was lacking of diversity in the metrics sufficient to tackle mission differentiation. So all of that was kind of coming to a head in 2021, and we saw legislative action. The Senate version of the budget bill actually called for a study of the performance funding formula. That was not in the final passed version of the budget bill, but it was a clear signal from our Senate colleagues that they wanted the commission to take a close look at this work. I can share that in 2021, I was still working in the Senate as a fiscal staffer, and I remember very clearly a lot of the concerns raised from several institutions and legislators about the legacy model. And so in 2021, the interim summer study following the budget bill, the committee passed several recommendations. The Committee on Fiscal Policy passed several recommendations, including that funding formula for the first time would be codified, that we would use more recent data in the model, that there would be a more close appreciation and time spent on mission differentiation, and specifically, and this is very important, that institutions would be measured only against themselves and not against other institutions, which also ties very closely in with mission differentiation. Following the interim, the Senate Enrolled Act 366, authored by Senator Eric Bassler in 2022, codified the commission's responsibility to develop a funding formula. It didn't spell out what the funding formula is exactly. It just basically said the commission shall create it, and it must be in line with the commission's strategic plan, which it is. They added additional legislative review of the formula, methodology, and metrics, which means that the commission now, every 2 years, brings its funding formula to the State Budget Committee, which is a committee made up of legislative and executive branch finance leaders, in order to basically explain any changes to the model, which we did 2 months ago. And then finally, the budget of 2023 also included a requirement for an entirely separate funding formula for Ivy Tech that focuses on employer needs, positive wage outcomes, and stackable credentials. So following all of that, the commission spent a considerable amount of time, probably about 15 months in 2022 and 2023, getting feedback from our commission members, legislators and staff, university leaders and staff, business leaders, community stakeholders, and others to develop the new funding formula. Looks like we've got about 15 minutes, so I will try and pick up the pace. So the new funding formula tried to tackle those three items very intentionally that the legislature put forward, specifically creating specific goals for each institution, comparing them against themselves, reducing the data lag. So for example, fiscal 26 funding, instead of being based on 2020, will be based on 2024 metrics. Mission differentiation, we've created separate weighting of the metrics by the institution type, and we've actually gone much further into that separation this biennia, an area where we try to continue to add more focus. So how do we measure in this new model? Well, in the new model, we utilize each institution's past performance and we create trends. We use about 6 years worth of data, and we set essentially improvement goals. Importantly, these goals are not necessarily a year-over-year increase, though for some metrics they are by the model. And this is important because if you're on let's say your overall completion rate, the trend is a 10% decline, largely driven by the decline in the college going rate from high school students. Well, if you're in a 10% decline and the commission said actually your goal is to have a 10% increase, you simply will not meet that goal. Now, you can make progress towards that goal, and our model does reward progress. However, it's super important that as an incentive tool, as a funding tool, that there is still the ability to earn dollars in the model. So we try to balance what we call stretch goals, right? We need these to be aspirational so the state can make progress. And we balance that against being obtainable, because a goal that is entirely obtainable will be entirely ignored by the institution, which does no one any good and will not support the state in its efforts. And so funding earned in the first year additionally creates a funding floor for the second year. I mentioned one of the benefits of the legacy model is every institution knew exactly how much funding they were going to earn in both years of the biennia. Well, this new model, it is forward looking. We are setting goals out in the future for data we have not yet collected, which means that we don't know what an institution will earn. Now, thankfully, the legacy model, there was certainty, but it was based on reallocation. So you had certainty of your funding, but your funding very well could have been a cut year over year. You knew the cut was coming, but it could have been a cut. In the new model, there is no reallocation, so we are only talking about an uncertainty around how much new money you will earn. But it's important to know whatever money is earned in the current biennia is added to an institution's base operating in the next biennia, which is very important for planning purposes of the institutions. So these metrics should look very similar. However, there are some new. As I mentioned, the old model only looked at the middle category of completion. The new model looks at enrollment, because if we complete every student we enroll, we are still not going to make significant enough progress towards our attainment goal. It'll help, it'll make a difference, it won't be enough. So we are also incentivizing institutions specifically to enroll more low-income youth. Those are Pell eligible students, as well as adults. I think people would be surprised to know that our four-year institutions, not even talking about the two-year, our four-year institutions enroll tens of thousands of adult students. And when we say adult, we're talking about someone who is age 25 and above. We continue to focus on completion. Completion continues to be over half of the weighting in the formula. In these categories, we've actually added additional weighting to on-time completion recently. And then adult completion is a brand new metric for the completion category for the reasons I just mentioned. We need more than just traditional age students if we're going to meet those attainment goals. And then finally, for the first time ever, the commission is measuring in partnership with the Department of Workforce Development. We are measuring graduate retention through wage record data, which frankly we're very proud of. It has been a lot of work to get here, but what that means is we can actually identify not only by institution, but by degree level, by program, the retention of graduates upon completion within. We look at, technically, we look at about 1.5 years after graduation to see if you meet our de minimis requirements for being caught in that data. But I want to reiterate, we are the first state in the nation to have an accountability and an incentive measurement in our funding formula specifically for graduate retention. And then let's talk about completions. As I mentioned earlier, access without completion is a false promise. I I think Ruth Watkins from Strata is the first person I heard say that, but it's a common refrain in higher education. And it's important, right? Because a student who enters, takes out student loans, and doesn't complete is in a worse place than a student who never entered to begin with because of that debt. So it's very, very important that when a student enters, they're made as knowledgeable as possible about the opportunities aligned with the credential they're seeking, and they're provided all the supports necessary to complete. That's why we're all here, I think, today. I think it's worth noting, though, that Indiana has made an incredible amount of progress in the completion category. We currently rank 10th in the nation for extended time completion of first-time full-time students pursuing an associate or bachelor's degree. That is incredible. We are 10th in the nation for those students who choose to enroll to eventually complete in that extended time category. That is a 15 percentage point increase from 2012. So in a little over the last decade, we've seen a 15 percentage point increase in overall completion. In that same period of time, however, we've actually experienced even greater increase in the on-time completion rate, which is a 20 percentage point increase, which is absolutely incredible. However, as I mentioned earlier, due to the declining high school going rate, overall completions, the number of credentials Indiana institutions are conferring every year, is declining and has been declining for several years. Thankfully, the decline is slowing, but it is making setting goals, attainable and challenging goals in the model, very challenging for the commission and for our institutions to try and find that correct balance. One thing I want to note is many policies have driven improvement in on-time and overall completion improvement in the state. It is not only the performance funding formula, but the simple reality is the funding formula is one of the commission's premier policy achievements, one of our premier policy priorities, and it has been for well over a decade. And so we do believe that it has some impact on the improvement we've seen in completions in the state. The new model does not include reallocation, as I previously mentioned. Your second year of funding cannot be less than your first year of funding in a new biennia to make sure that there's operating certainty, especially when institutions are setting tuition and fees. And then any funding that's earned is added to the next budget, as I previously mentioned. Currently in the funding model, unearned dollars revert back to the state. So every institution has a line item appropriation in the budget bill for performance funding. And that is the amount they can receive, the maximum amount they can receive for that year. Any amount less than that they receive, any amount left after they receive their distribution does revert to the state. The commission is and I should note, about 74% of current fiscal year dollars were earned, leaving just under $6 million that were not earned. Our commission, legislators, a number of individuals have asked, how do we feel about 74%? It's a hard question to answer. In some sense, I would say that if we distributed 100% of funding, rightfully, policymakers, the funders, the purse string holders, our legislature should be asking the question of, did you set challenging enough goals? And maybe we did, and there was some other reason for why the institutions all blew those goals out of the water. On the flip end, if we were distributing 20% of funding, I think a reasonable question would be, were your goals obtainable, and is the model functioning as a funding tool? So I think that 74% is probably somewhere around the sweet spot, and I've continued to share that it is my expectation that we never fund 0 or 100%. But importantly, that leaves dollars that the General Assembly has earmarked for higher education left unspent at a time when, as I previously mentioned, our funding for higher education is relatively low nationally. So the commission is, this coming legislative session, seeking to allow for essentially a competitive student success grant, not dissimilar from the student success coaches that the commission was able to fund through legislative support this most recent biennia, where essentially dollars would be earmarked to be one-time money, and they would be earmarked for direct support for 21st century scholars or other low-income students, first-generation students, et cetera. And so there is a desire to keep those dollars within the post-secondary education funding world. But at the same time, it's important for the integrity of the funding model that they be distributed in a way that is not simply going to go to the bottom line of the institutions as they were not earned through performance measurements. So really, in summary, the new formula has a number of advantages. There's significant legislative support because it was built off of their direct feedback. There's no state funding reduction built into this model because it is all new money and there's no reallocation. This incentivizes collaboration between the institutions. Not a day goes by, I feel like I don't hear about more 2+2 programs between Ivy Tech or Vincennes and a four-year institution, or transfer agreements between four-year institutions, et cetera, because no longer is one institution's success the detriment of another. And then additionally, the model funds improvement over growth. And I think it's really important to note that improvement doesn't always mean year-over-year growth. As I mentioned earlier, if you're on a 10% decline and you change that to a 2% decline, I would say that is improvement. And I think that matters. But there's still some disadvantages compared to other models. There is a new type of funding uncertainty. It is all new funding. There isn't that there isn't that threat of a funding reduction year over year. But it does make it more challenging for our institutions to budget because they don't know how much of the new money in the second year of the budget they're going to get when they're setting tuition and fee targets in the first year. Right now, any unearned funds are reverted, which again is definitely not the desire. I should note the commission did seek a non-reverting fund initially with the rollout of this. That was supported by the House. It was not supported by the Senate. And so we've tried to continue having conversations with our legislative partners to understand how we can best utilize these dollars to make investments that support other state investments, right? So if we can invest in student support initiatives that specifically target financial aid receiving students, that's just helping to get more success out of already invested dollars. And then finally, because we aren't including reallocation and we're only including new money, there is a much smaller pool of incentive funding at play here. I think in the the fiscal 23 year, there was about $85 million in total in the performance funding pool. In 2021, there's about $85 million in the performance funding pool. Now it's much, I think we had, well, I'm not going to guess, it's somewhere around $45 million. It really just depends on how much new money. Every 1% of new state dollars equals about $13 million or so. And so, if were they to appropriate 3 or 4% of new funding, you're looking at $30-some million compared to 85. So there is a smaller pool of incentive funding. But with 3 minutes to spare, that is all I have for you today. I'd be more than happy. I see there's something in the chat, so Lucas, feel free to throw stuff at me. Okay, you already got it. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions. My contact information is here. We'll share these slides. Be more than happy to have a conversation with you. Any feedback you have. I spend a lot of time talking with institutions, talking with legislative staff, talking with professionals in the space to try and understand where the commission has a policy lever and where we don't, and try to model the funding formula in such a way that it maximizes our policy levers and our opportunity to lean into good public policy for the state. But it is always a work in progress, and we're always open to improvements. So anyways, yeah, I'd be more than happy for your feedback and any thoughts that you may have. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming today, and hopefully the post new parent leave jitters weren't too bad or too jarring for everyone. Lucas, do you have a joke to leave us with?
Yes, one final thought. Why was the bee's hair sticky? Because he used a honeycomb.
And
all right,
with
everybody.
that,
thank you for joining us. We'll have more information on the webpage, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.